All right, okay, it's still working, cool. Hi, so once again, I am Sonya Iverson, and I am the president of Slackline US, and also on the board of directors for the International Slackline Association. And I'm also the person who receives the accident reports, if you've ever taken the time to fill out one of our SAIR forms, which is the Slackline Accident and Incident Report form. So what I'm going to be talking about, hopefully fairly quickly today, is what we know from the reports we've received so far, the data that we've kind of gathered. And this data was made available to us in part through some analysis done by one of our volunteers, a guy named Dan Walsh out of the US. And I'm going to be showing you some actual graphs. So hopefully you stay awake, but I think it's interesting graphs. All right, so first off, what is the SAIR, and why do we call it that? SAIR stands for the Slackline Accident and Incident Report Form. And when we first started this form, we actually had a bit of a discussion because there aren't really any accidents. And I don't like the word accident, but since we work in a multicultural community with the International Slackline Association, we weren't sure that the word incident would translate as easily. And so we're using both words. But I want to be very clear that in pretty much every instance, with a few act of God kind of situations, what we're usually talking about is an incident, meaning it's not a freak accident that couldn't have been prevented. Most of these injuries and gear failures that I'm going to talk about briefly could easily have been prevented either with better training, better concentration, or better attention to detail while rigging. So we don't like to talk about accidents, but the word's in there anyways. So I highlighted that word. So we get these reports. If you go to our website, you'll find a form for SAIR, or if you go to sair.slacklineinternational.org, you can find the form there. And it's as simple as we can possibly make it while still being useful. It asks for your name, your email address, a couple of questions about what type of an incident we're talking about. Was it a Highline incident, a trickline incident? Was somebody hurt? Was someone not hurt? Was it a gear failure? Questions like that. And then there's a brief description area where you can tell us what happened. That's pretty much what the form is. So please, it doesn't take very long. Take some time to fill out some reports for us. From these reports, what we do is we gather all that information together and we publish what we think is useful for the community to know. So this is part of that. All right, so what we have today is, as of July 2016, we've received 110 reports through the SAIR forms. And some of these go back as far as 1999, so we have some old school people out there reporting for us, which is cool. Most of the data I'm going to talk about today talks about anything that was submitted to us before February and has happened in 2015 or earlier. So we'll have more data as it's being analyzed. From this data, we've published the Eardrum waterline warning, which is if you fall off a waterline and you impact the water on the side of your ear, it's been known to cause eardrum damage or make people black out. So just something to consider when you're waterlining. Maybe don't waterline alone. And the Highline injury warning, which is a brief document talking about the types of injuries that we've seen from highlining, which are surprisingly few and far between, actually, so cool. But things to be aware of and how to prevent them. And the webbing slippage document we mentioned earlier, midline safety we mentioned earlier, and then we're currently in the process about to publish basically the data I'm going to show you here. And then also some case studies of specific incidents. All right, so from the reports, we have 69 reports I'm going to be talking about most of this talk. And you can see here that the larger amount of them come from the German, the French, and the American slackline populations. Although that's likely due in part to the size of those populations and the fact that most of these reports, or all these reports, were recorded in English, which I guess German and French, but they all speak English. All right, so as you can well imagine, most of these reports also happened in France, Germany, and the USA, and you can see the other distributions here. This isn't necessarily representative of how many accidents are happening where, so much as who's reporting the form or some combination thereof, where our audience is. What kind of injuries do we see? Which I think is kind of interesting, that most of the injuries we see probably easily predicted would be fractures, broken bones, broken fingers, broken legs, sprains, and then various other things. But we don't actually see a lot of serious injuries from slacklining. It's mostly joints and bone injuries. Where do those injuries happen? This is what I think is one of the more interesting graphs, and I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on it to say that we see the most injuries, at least in our reports, from tricklining. Not entirely surprising. It's pretty impactful. I know it hurts. That's why I stopped doing it. Also from long lining, which again makes a lot of sense when you tend to be up high and on longer exposed lines, like the falls are just less controllable. And then also in basic slacklines and highlines, waterlines, midlines, we don't see as many injuries there. And for a lot of reasons that makes sense. You know, basic slacklines, when you're down here, it's kind of hard to get hurt. On a highline, there's nothing to hit for the most part, unless you're close to the edges, so not a lot of injuries there. And then waterlines and midlines, same thing. And if you want to take a look at this data, it'll be published soon, but this actually breaks down like what type of injuries happen in what types of, disciplines of the sport. And then the types of injuries, and what we see here predominantly is that the majority of the injuries that we hear about, 30 out of this column, I fell off the slackline and I got hurt, is the most common thing we hear in the reports. Whether that's I tried to bail from a trick while I was tricklining and it didn't go very well, or I fell off of a slackline, a highline, trickline, long line, sorry. Usually it's I was trying a new skill and I fell. That's most of what we hear. There's not actually really any reports about equipment failure and rigging errors that lead to an injury. Basically, it's not usually the gear fails, it's the skill fails. So something to consider. One bit of data I find particularly interesting is in January we put out another survey that is unrelated to the SAIR that was asking for demographic information about the population. Asking, where do you slackline, how often do you slackline, are you a highliner, how much gear do you buy, questions like that. And one piece of data that I'm going to show you about this is basically how many people participate in each of the disciplines of slacklining. So we put this report out, and in less than a day, we had 700 responses. And by the time we finished collecting those responses, we had over 1,400. Most of those were in English. We also had some come in Portuguese and Polish when we translated the form, but more than 1,400 responses, which I think is awesome. From that data, we went through and we looked at, there was a question that said, how often do you highline? Always, often, sometimes, rarely, or never. And then how long do you trickline? Same thing. And I went through that data and I gathered all of the people who said that they highline always, often, or sometimes, and put them into the category of highliners. And all the people who said that they trickline always, often, or sometimes went into that category for trickliners. And that's what these numbers are. So, back one. Basically, this is from that report, from that survey, 74% of people claim to be low-line slackliners. That doesn't mean that they're not other things too. 75% are longliners, 17, almost 18% are trickliners, etc. Why this data is particularly interesting here and is because of this graph of how many injuries do we see in the different sports. And this isn't perfect, it's survey data. And we don't know for sure that our audience is really representative of the community, the people filling out the survey. But if I take that graph and I convert it to percentages, what we see is that longlining has the highest population of people who participate and a pretty high injury rate, but by population, it's not like unexpected. Highlining has like a medium population, almost 40% of us are highliners, but there's only 4.8% of the injuries reported coming from highlining, so that's cool, we're safe, just rig well, please. Oops, there was supposed to be one more bar here, I must have moved it. The other point I was going to make is that tricklining, at least from the audience that we are talking to, that are answering our surveys, has the lowest population and the highest injury rate. So, yay, Mickey. So, tricklining's cool. I think it's beautiful. Stay safe, guys. And let's maybe form that trickline commission so we can talk about how to make tricklining safer. All right, so I'm going to briefly talk through a few scenarios because too often I think people don't think about safety in slacklining. Like Jerry was talking about with the loose backup, they're like, oh, well, mainline failures don't happen, I'm not worried about it. They do happen. And we have some reported through the SAIR, and then I also have a notebook where I've been recording anything that anyone tells me about a gear failure, a line that broke, something that almost went bad but was okay. And I've got all those written down. So what I'm going to tell you now are some stories that I've been told so that you guys know them, and I don't hear people say, oh yeah, but it's never failed before anymore. I don't like that phrase. So one study, South America in 2014, this is part of why I looked up the coyote, or the Wile E. coyote, is I wanted to find something that resembled this, but didn't quite work, but it's still fun. Is 30 meters long, 30 meters high, and one boulder as the only anchor on the tensioning side, with both the main and the backup slinging the same boulder. One of the riggers noted while they were rigging that they weren't sure this boulder was good enough, but they rigged it anyways. Highliner is hanging in his harness, taping the line, not actually on the line, not falling, not whipping, when the boulder shifts completely off the ledge and has a complete anchor failure. Hanging on the line, he grabs onto the webbing while the boulder falls and the line pendulums across the gap. And 30 meters high, 30 meters long, so he swings across, impacts the canyon wall on the other side, and is able to relatively safely exit the line from the ground. A fun tidbit about that story. Broken rib? Sprained pelvis, hip, something. So relatively minor. He's really lucky. And abrasions on his hands. Funny tidbit about that story, he went back to school to become a geologist and study rocks. So, next time you wonder if that anchor will hold, you should wonder whether or not you can hold onto the webbing. All right, estimating the weight and the strength of a boulder can be quite tricky. Maybe it has a bunch of pebbles under it and it's just going to slide away. So something to keep in mind when you're rigging with natural anchors like rocks and boulders is that you really have to be certain it's going to hold. And there is a website online. You can find a link to it from the ISA's useful links page. But there is a tool online which will help you calculate the weight of a boulder to use it for an anchor. So please look at those kind of tools. Like, don't just guess and say, I think it's big enough. You'd be surprised how much force you can put on a rock. All right, case study number 2. I'm taking a long time. I'm going to roll here as fast as I can. FRHM, a lot of you guys have probably heard about the lightning line that Samuel Voulery had last year. Well, there's been a second incident of this sort of phenomenon happening. And this line was 800 meters long, about 150 meters high, left up in a storm. And the next day they noticed some abrasion about 15 meters from the anchor. Something funny with the webbing, didn't look right. And when they take it down, the main line shows multiple burn and fray marks across a span of the webbing. But the amsteel backup showed no signs of damage. This is particularly interesting to me. It's not data that we can really analyze because it's 2 incidents. But in Sam's line, where they had the same type of webbing for the main line and the backup, both the main and the backup were damaged by the storm. And we don't think the consensus is not that it was lightning. It wasn't lightning shooting through the webbing. It seems to be that there's a static charge that builds up in the wet webbing and then is released, burning the webbing. And I'm not a physicist, so don't ask me more about that. But the interesting point for this is that if you have 2 pieces of webbing and they both got burned, but you had a piece of webbing and a piece of amsteel and the amsteel didn't get damaged, this might be a good reason to consider using 2 different materials while rigging long high lines if they're exposed, is that they don't have the same conductive properties. One other thing, here's some pictures of this line, by the way. One other interesting thing to note is that to date, there have only been 4 high lines rigged, at least to my knowledge, please inform me if I'm wrong. They were over 500 meters long. 2 of those high lines were damaged in lightning storms. So that's some scary numbers. Please inspect your lines as best you can and be very aware of taking your own risks. All right, so here's another scary one for you. Anybody see anything wrong with this picture? Raise your hand.
Yes! Yes!
Who doesn't see anything wrong with it?
I don't want to raise my hand.
So this is a blown up, like cropped version of the picture, but I showed this on my cell phone to about 20 very experienced highliners and highline riggers. And Jerry over here is the only one that caught it in under 30 seconds. That's not a figure 8. That's half of a figure 8. It has only gone through 1 strand. But at a quick glance, the tail of the rope's pointing the right direction. It's shaped like an 8. it would be really easy to overlook. This was at a Highline festival. This line had been rigged correctly all week, checked daily, and to the best of our knowledge, a participant at some point decided to retie the knot on the rings and didn't finish retying it. Another participant went out to tie into this line by himself, no attendance at the line, and thankfully noticed that it was that it was not tied correctly. He's right here. So please, that is a great round of applause. Thank this guy for saving his own life and potentially someone else's by reporting this issue. And thank the person who trained him to check the leash well. All right, so here's the numbers on that. Buddy checks literally will save lives. If you don't think you need a buddy check, Lynn Hill needed a buddy check when she decked, and she's one of the most famous climbers in the world. So I don't care how good you are, ask for a buddy check, take a buddy check. And if you don't know how to do a buddy check, we have an advisory about that on the website. All right, speaking of buddy checks, this guy could have used one too. Also in South America, 30 meters long, 10 meters high over water. A climber who was not part of the festival asked if he could use somebody's harness and try the Highline. And I say climber ? Because he didn't seem to understand how harnesses worked in a couple of ways. He was offered a buddy check and he declined. He said he'd been highlining for a year and a half and he knew what he was doing, and he went to the line by himself. Shortly after, somebody saw him hit the water 10 meters down under a midline he was supposed to be tied into. And he did not tie into the leash correctly and hit the water below in between two boulders. He told somebody as he was falling, he could see his head would hit a rock, and he rolled and hit it with his arm instead. Like I said, buddy checks save lives, and as a rigger at a festival, something to consider is, even not at a festival, even with your friends, you may be liable if that person gets hurt, so insist on a buddy check. And here's what his tie-in looked like. That is not appropriate. I don't even know what that knot is pretending to be. And this is what's left of the harness. We think he had seen people tying in with their leash around their hip, like on a tag or tucked, and he thought they were clipping into their belay loops. Or gear loops, sorry. Oh, yeah, and here's the better part, too. It held the first fall, not the second, not the bounce. Yeah. All right, so buddy checks, even if the people say they don't need them. All right, I think this is my last case study. Trad gear and Highline anchors. I don't like it. It was not designed for consistent cyclic loading. It is not intended to be pulled repeatedly. And it's made of aluminum so that it doesn't damage the rocks. But slacklines and aluminum, I don't like that either, but that's another story. So I don't actually remember, and I didn't have my notes about how long and high this line was, but it was high enough to kill someone. When they built an entire anchor with a master point, all on trad gear, multiple pieces of trad gear, in a single fixture. It was all dependent upon the same block of rock. And at a last minute thought, while they were rigging, someone took the tail of, I don't remember if it was the webbing or the rope, but they took the tail of the rope and tied it around a horn, a chunk of rock, in a separate fixture, just as an extra backup. The block of stone shifted, and the entire anchor blew. The complete master point, main and backup, all on trad gear, gone. And that guy is alive because they slung a rock at the last second. So, trad gear wasn't designed for this, and if you are rigging with trad gear, please very carefully understand what you're doing and recognize that you're taking your own risks, and anyone else who gets on that line should understand it as well. All right. Oh, sorry. One more. I think I misnumbered that. Span sets are not infallible. I'll go through that really quick. There was also a long Highline rigged recently here in Europe where instead of an A-frame, they were using the edge of a snowplow, like the bowl of a snowplow. And the span sets were padded going over the plow. And so once they rigged, they padded everything, and they're like, okay, we took care of abrasion, it's done. Well, when somebody's surfing that line, the padding doesn't always work. You can easily cut through your padding if you're actually working on a sharp edge, just like what Jerry was showing. And the edge of the plow cut through the padding, cut through the span set, and they were using what I've come to term an imaginary backup. It would not have caught it. Like Jerry was talking about, the backup probably would not have saved anybody on this particular line. But again, the tail of the webbing tied off to a separate point prevented the backup from having to engage entirely and kept the guy off the ground. So span sets aren't infallible. Please don't say, well, it's a green span set. Span sets don't break. I don't need a backup. Always use a backup. And in summary, most of the reports we've received to date talk about injuries. And while that's valuable for us, there's only so much that we can glean from I fell off the slackline and I got hurt. Like, we know that happens. What we really want to know about is I rigged a line and I forgot to close a quick link and it almost blew. Or I rigged a line and I didn't place the bolts well and the bolts came out. Or I rigged a line and I cut a span set. Please tell us these stories, whether anyone got hurt or not. Even if it didn't actually go wrong, but you noticed it almost went wrong. Please let us know. Those are the stories that are most informative to the rest of the community to learn how not to mess up the next time. So if you have an incident story and you want to be part of a promotional video, I have an idea I've been waiting for participants for, so come find me at some point today, tomorrow. And also, the Slackline Accident and Incident Report Form is now available in Portuguese and French, and the German will be available soon. If anyone's interested in translating into other languages, please let me know. Sorry I took so long, but I am now done. Any questions? Cool, thank you guys. If there's any questions, you can find me afterwards.